Welcome to Contagious Thinking with Thomas Verstraeten, a podcast from P95. This is where global health gets personal and where data, science, and insight come to life. Let's get the show started.
Well, hello and welcome to Contagious Thinking, our podcast on the state of infectious disease and how we see it at P95. Today is our third episode, and I have a very special guest with us, Rodrigo DeAntonio. Rodrigo, very welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Tom. It's very good to be in your podcast. My name is Rodrigo DeAntonio. I was born in Colombia. I'm a medical epidemiologist, health economist, and doctor in public health. I'm now living in Panama for the last 16 years, and I've been working in clinical and epidemiological clinical trials, especially for vaccines in different indications.
Rodrigo, you're absolutely the person we would like to talk to because our focus today is going to be Latin America and more specifically how Latin America has come to play a very important role in general drug development, but certainly so in vaccine development. So let's maybe start with that. How did Latin America become such an important region in the development of new vaccines? I know, Rodrigo, for many years you've been involved in very many projects. Could you give us a little bit of a history lesson here and tell us what happened? How did Latin America become so important for developing new vaccines?
The story goes back to even 30 years already. It was mainly based on the target infectious disease, some as rotavirus and HPV and pneumococcal vaccine, and also some arboviral diseases such as dengue. So based on the epidemiology and the focus to prevent some of the, especially the most severe features of these diseases. So there was an interest at the beginning from some industry partners to start developing these trials. This starts working with some of the key opinion leaders, especially for infectious diseases and for HPV, also for OB/GYN specialists. So based on the epidemiological characteristics, so there was an interest to come to the region. And this was at the starting point for some of the most important phase 3 clinical trials, which were aiming especially for efficacy and safety. Those studies were really successful, leading to some of these vaccines become licensed and were really easily accessible to the population. So there was this interest in the region, not only from the industry partners, but also from decision makers on how this data could be really used for decision-making process.
Personally, I remember very well the rotavirus vaccine development when I was at GSK at the time, where there was a need to have a really big study because of the concern that rose on intussusception as a potential side effect. So there was a need to enroll a very large number of children, which would have been challenging to do that just in Europe or in the United States. And I think Latin America, where the burden of this disease was high, as you say, was particularly keen to collaborate and very successful in bringing that vaccine to the end of the phase 3 trial and eventually on the global market. So that's my memory. But you mentioned rotavirus, pneumococcal vaccines, HPV, dengue. So it seems like it's not just limited to a particular type of vaccines or particular age groups. It seems like pretty much most vaccines have been studied in Latin America over the last couple of decades.
Yes, it's been like that, Tom, especially based on the epidemiological features, but also I think that in terms of the diversity of the population here in Latin America, because we have different ethnicities, but also some difference in the seasonal patterns for some of these diseases, and based also in the health system infrastructure, which were also very important to have this like public and private collaboration. And I think that the last point that is very important, there was a big acceptance from the population to participate in those trials, leading to some benefits of participating in the trials, to also have a better medical follow-up complementary to the health system.
Correct. And what was also very striking was the high acceptance of vaccines in general in the population in Latin America, which, as you already pointed out to me, having favorable to vaccination in general also tends to make people favorable to research, and the other way around. When people start hesitating about vaccines, they start hesitating about research as well.
Yes, that's correct. So far, I think that here in Latin America, there is not a really impact of anti-vaccines groups. And as you said, usually anti-vaccines comes with anti-research movements. But I think that so far in the region, back in the days, this has not been really a big issue. Now with social media, and especially after the pandemic, there was some movements, but more associated with misinformation, which I think it's also one critical point for those who are working as me in research, that is always giving the possibility to the population to clarify any potential questions that they have with vaccines in terms of safety, how they work. This will lead also to acceptance once that they are used in real world.
Now you mentioned the pandemic, the magic word. Of course, we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. So, you already talked about very many vaccines that were developed over the last decades, and then came the pandemic, right? And then Latin America once more was in the center of attention after the pandemic kind of moved, let's say, from Europe, North America towards Latin America. How did that affect you, Rodrigo, and how did that affect R&D, clinical research in Latin America in general? How did you experience that, and what do you think has changed since the pandemic?
Here in Latin America, first we have a first experience with a previous pandemic, that it was the influenza H1N1. And at that point, there was a participation, which I think it was like a rehearsal for the COVID pandemic. Then when the pandemic was initiated, the first point, it was for those ongoing trials that we were having. So some of these studies were canceled at the beginning or were delayed, but we also were conducting some trials in the region that were ongoing. And there was a challenge to continue surveillance activities, both for safety and efficacy endpoints. And of course, at some point, what we were trying to do, it was working with regulators to facilitate the approval pathway during an epidemic situation. After 3 or 4 months, so of course, there was a focus at the beginning, mainly in US and in some cases for Europe, but even in the first trials, for example, for the Oxford vaccine, Brazil initiated the participation, and then some other manufacturers and also supranational organizations such as WHO with Solidarity trials, they were coming to the region looking for those experience sites, and also, of course, to facilitate the enrollment in a very expedite manner. So there was work to do, especially with ethics committees, and for those new platforms, especially for RNA vaccines, which were newly used. But for established platforms, it was possible to incorporate some clinical trials very early on. So Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, Panama were really prepared to initiate the studies. And then after that, it was possible to license some of these vaccines.
And actually, implementation of vaccination followed quite quickly as well in Latin America, with what I recall, a very large variety of different vaccines became available in Latin America, maybe partially as a consequence of being so heavily involved in the clinical trials. Right? So there was a benefit.
Yes, and actually it was a challenge for the clinical trials, because we were conducting some of those trials for efficacy trials when the first vaccines became available in some of our countries. For example, here in Panama, it was end of December of 2020, and we were already discussing introduction of those vaccines, especially for high-risk groups, healthcare professionals. So it was a challenge to keep the subjects in the study. So some of the trials had to be adapted in order to complete, especially the safety follow-up. But I think that it was really possible based on the experience from previous years that we had. Yeah, and also with engagement with different stakeholders at the public health authorities.
And looking back, Rodrigo, we're now a few years past the pandemic. It seems longer to some people. Seems like a long time ago, but it's not that long ago. Anyways, looking back now, how do you feel that the landscape has changed? Maybe let's start from a regulatory perspective. Has the pandemic and the need to set up trials rapidly in such instances, has that changed the regulatory pathway for new trials in Latin America in a positive way, in a negative way? How would you see that?
Yes, I think that, well, especially for here in the region now, people is more aware of the, for example, seamless clinical trials design. At the beginning, it was very challenging to discuss this with the authorities because moving rapidly from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. So now this approach has been used and it's accepted by the authorities. In terms of timeline, sometimes some countries depends really on the political situation. So you can see that some countries such as Argentina and especially also some of the Central American countries, regulatory timelines are now very competitive. So this has led, of course, to new trials, not only for vaccines, but also for some other situations. And I think that as good neighbors in the region, when some of the other countries such as Brazil and Colombia have noted that the other countries now they have like expedited process, now they are discussing the possibility to expedite the regulatory review process. So Colombia and Brazil and Mexico, of course, that they are very important from a representative point of view. I think that now they are moving that way. The second one, I think that in terms of capabilities, I think that pandemic really bring us the possibility to use some electronic tools, medical chart, having remote monitoring features for the sponsors and for the CROs, having the possibility to use patient-reported outcomes via application, both for safety but also for efficacy. This was something that it became really useful during the pandemic. In the negative way, I think that the acceptance, especially for some of the trials from the population point of view, it has become a bit challenging, especially for some platforms of vaccines. But I would say that it is still positive, and even after the pandemic, it is still possible to have high recruitment rates across the different countries in the region.
And stepping away for a moment from clinical research, how about acceptance of vaccination in general? Has that suffered in Latin America? We see in many regions of the world, right, that after the COVID pandemic, there is some increased hesitancy, some doubt about the value of some vaccines. Do you experience the same in Latin America?
Yes, it was the same. Of course, during the pandemic, vaccination rates, especially during the first year of life, most of them drop out. Latin America, as we were discussing before, used to have like vaccination coverage above 90%. So especially during the first years in the pandemic, those vaccination rates across the region decreased significantly. So governments put a lot of efforts. It was, I think, a combination. First, hesitancy of the population, but also at some points because the healthcare professionals at the beginning, they were really focused on pandemic activities. So it was also a difficulty for that. It's going better now. There are a lot of efforts from societies, supranational organizations, but I think that we haven't gone back to the pre-pandemic vaccine coverage. So especially you can find some children with 0 doses in the region. It was estimated like 1.5 million of the total cohort in the region that they don't have received at least one vaccine dose, which I think it's very, very important. At the beginning, COVID vaccination was really accepted, but I think that now there is still some hesitancy, and now this is contradictory, for example, with some new vaccines which are in the or immunization strategies such as RSV. that are well accepted, and so this needs to be
There's
like
a
a
bit of a
balance.
negative connotation around COVID, yeah,
Yeah.
which is something you see in
Yes.
other countries, a kind of a fallout from the pandemic. Okay, so I guess what you mentioned earlier on, the importance of communication has become even more important, I guess, to have the right information to your study subjects and to make sure that they're fully aware and that they can ask all the questions that they want to ask, I guess has become even more crucial than it was before.
Yes, absolutely. Especially working with the ethics committees and also with regulators in terms of the messages that we need to provide, and also preparing the staff who is interacting, because especially for vaccines, you know that the model is community based. So you need to engage not only with the parents, but also with the families and also with the community leaders, so that they can clarify the questions. And I think that is very important that you take the time to clarify any potential questions that they have, because it is something that could come up from anyone. And also, I think that from the other side, especially for those who are interacting with the communities, it's also very important to be very transparent and to provide really clear answers, what you know and what you don't know, and what is the rationale, especially to participate in the trials, and how you will keep them posted in case of any potential situation emerge.
So today, Rodrigo, you are an investigator. I know you have a very efficient and well-known, well-recognized site in Panama. But if you look at a more regional level, if you would talk to sponsors who are looking, for the right place to conduct their trials, what would be the arguments for them to look at Latin America as a potential region to conduct a clinical trial?
I will say that right now we are moving morely to work like in network, in a collaborative network, in order to engage better with sponsors, but also with CROs. I think that moving apart from the epidemiology, you need to have the population to participate in the trials. So especially higher recruitment rates is going to be very important. And I think that the region has proven this. The second point is the regulatory timelines. It is very important to have like a very well-known process for approval, bioethics, also by the Ministry of Health, and also for import license for the investigational products. The third point is experience and key opinion leaders, and also in terms of quality. Our region has been audited, has been inspected, and the results has been very good overall. And last, I think that we are very competitive from a cost efficient point of view. I think that that the balance of conducting there, you have a variety of countries, so it is possible to get a good value for money in terms of what you're planning to do. So those points: population, recruitment and retention rate; second, regulatory timelines; third, quality; and fourth, the cost. Absolutely.
And it's kind of nice to see that cost is not, the single most important driver, and that quality is actually also something you can be very proud of in your region, what you have achieved and what you have proven in the past. So that's certainly very important to keep in mind. In our last podcast, we had a guest from Africa, and we talked a little bit about unification of regulatory pathways across the African region with the African Medical Agency that's being set up, similar to what we have in Europe. Do you see any such movement happening in Latin America, or should we still think of Latin America as a mix of different countries? How much harmonization is happening or is possible in the region?
There's been some efforts in terms, especially for training for regulators, and also from the bioethics point of view, led mainly by the Pan American Health Organization, and also by some efforts from infectious disease societies. But so far, we don't have an initiative really try to set up everything. Countries in the region still are working based on their own regulations that is very similar to introducing new vaccines. So each country, they have their own advisory committees. At least this is my personal opinion. I don't see that there's going to be like an effort to really put everything under one single initiative. But I think that what might be important is to work in collaborative manner from a side point of view in order to identify what might be the best strategy for a new trial to be conducted based on regulatory timelines, epidemiology, the seasonal patterns for some infectious diseases, which I think it also gives you the opportunity to plan and conduct your study in a more efficient manner.
Which kind of reminds me of another advantage of your region. It's the language, right? I mean, of course, besides Brazil, which is Portuguese, pretty much everybody is Spanish speaking, and that certainly facilitates, I would say, the networking between investigators
That's
and the
correct.
coherence between them. So that's something we cannot boast
Yeah.
in Europe, of course. You and I know each other from vaccine development and working together in the infectious disease field. But of course, clinical research is much bigger in Latin America than just vaccines. Are there particular therapeutic areas that you say these are the ones where we can position ourselves well, or would you say we can basically do any work in any therapeutic area?
Based also on the an epidemiological profile of the region, of course, all the cardiometabolic indications is really very important. Now we are like in a transition moving from infectious diseases to non-transmissible diseases such as obesity, hypertension, and cardiovascular diseases as well. So I think that's really a good focus, and there's been a good experience also working with that. Neuroscience is also another field which I think is very important. We have now more life expectancy, so it is also getting more common to research around, especially dementia, Alzheimer, and of course cancer. Well, both including therapeutics, vaccines, which I think is also very aligned with what we have discussed for infectious diseases, but also some treatments, immunotherapy. I think that there is an interest, and also the epidemiological profile of the region also facilitates, and there are very good opinion leaders in the region, which I think is very important. And last but not least, especially after the pandemic, we have seen like a boom in especially with device trials, including robotics and some other medical devices. The regulatory pathway, it has been very successful. So especially for startup companies, it has become really interesting. The countries in the region, they have been able to complete the regulatory timelines very well, and also enrolling and committing with the quality of the trial. So I think that there are plenty of opportunities for other therapeutic areas.
I guess it's like you mentioned in the beginning, it comes back to the epidemiology, right?
Yes.
And for some diseases, unfortunately, like obesitas, the burden is also there in Latin America as it is like in North America. And of course, aging, that's a positive development, of course, that the life expectancy has increased as well. And now you are also facing the diseases of aging. So where there is burden, yeah, there is an opportunity to do research. So it sounds like there's not really a limit to the type of research or the type of therapeutic area that one should work around when considering clinical research in Latin America.
Yep, absolutely.
Rodrigo, I think we've covered quite a few areas. Is there anything particular you wanted to mention about your side, about Panama, about Latin America in general before we close off this podcast? Any last words?
We have discussed today that there is a big opportunity. When you look the big picture, I think that we have done some research, and I think that only less than 10% of all the clinical trials are coming to the region. So I think that there is really a big opportunity to continue expanding. I think that we should continue engaging with the regulators and give this opportunity that through research, there is a big opportunity also of getting investment for the countries, which I think it will translate into a better health for everyone. And these initiatives of collaborative networks, it should bring some additional advantages from a regulatory point of view for recruitment and retention for participants, and also, as we have discussed, from a cost-efficient point of view. And last but not least, the use of technology and potentially to expanding the end-to-end, because, well, Tom, we used to work in the epidemiological trials to prepare for clinical trials, and now we have had some experience also after licensing, which I think it's also a good opportunity to work together with the different surveillance networks and give like the end-to-end full clinical development for a new product. So I think that there is an opportunity here in Latin America now with technology, artificial intelligence, and collaborative networks, which would be very successful.
Well, with these wise words, Rodrigo, I will leave you. Thank you very much for joining our podcast today.
Thank you very much, Tommy. It has been great to be with you today.
Thanks for listening to Contagious Thinking, a podcast from P95. You can find us in all major streaming platforms. Join us next time for more conversations that move public health forward.